Death and the Cornish Fiddler by Deryn Lake. Side 11. "I'm sorry if I'm being indelicate," said John, "but I have a witness who tells me that you visited Diana Warwick in her room on the night she was murdered, or rather, I should say, in the early hours of the next day." The gaffer nodded slowly, then said, "It's true enough. I did go in to see her, but she was already dead." John sat silently for a moment or two. "How did you know?" he asked eventually. "I knew by her stillness, sir." "I see. Can you describe to me exactly what you found?" The Cornish Fiddler sighed. "I went into the room. The door was not locked, and I called her name, but she did not answer me. I crossed over to the bed and shook her gently by the shoulders, but she made no response at all. Eventually I found her wrist and took her pulse, but there was nothing. So I concluded, sir, rightly or wrongly, that the poor girl had been done to death. But why presume that? Why did you not think she had died naturally? Because women of 40 in good health rarely do so." The apothecary was silent, thinking of the exceptional gifts of those who are blind. "How did you know Diana?" he asked eventually. "She and I were old friends," the gaffer replied firmly. "Then you had been her client," the apothecary said. The black spectacles shifted once more, turning in John's direction and fixing him with a sightless gaze. "I was, once, long ago, before my, accident." "So you weren't born blind?" John exclaimed, interested because of Sir John Fielding's catastrophe when he had been aged 18. The Cornish Fiddler shook his head. "No. I was in my late 20s when it happened. Oh, that was a grievous day, I can tell you. Anyway, I put on my black spectacles and walked away from the whole thing. I took to the road, playing my violin, and have been living by my wits ever since." "What happened, exactly?" "That I'd rather not say, sir. It is a subject too painful to discuss before a comparative stranger." "Of course. I quite understand." "Do you, sir? Well, that's very good of you, I must say." John looked up sharply, certain that he had heard a certain mocking tone underlying the gaffer's speech. But the expression on the face of the man was utterly bland, almost emotionless. Inwardly he sighed. He felt as if the blind fiddler had given him a certain amount of information and no more. He also felt that it was impossible for him to ask any further questions, that, for want of a better phrase, he had been outmanoeuvred. The apothecary got to his feet. "Thank you so much for telling me what you have. I'm extremely grateful to you." The fiddler also stood up. "Most kind of you to say so, sir. Now, would you give me your arm to the nearest alehouse? I can hear by the silence that my fellow musicians have gone on ahead." John took the fellow's hand and tucked it through his arm, then proceeded slowly out of the courtyard, looking around him as he went. "A fine place, this," he said. "Who owns it?" "It used to belong to the Marquis of Dorchester, but it changed hands after a game of cards." "Really?" said John, intrigued. "Yes. It is owned these days by Lord Lisle, a dull fellow but an excellent gambler." "And what happened to the Marquis?" "He vanished, sir. Out he went into the night, and nobody ever heard of him again." "God's wounds! And the title?" "Inherited by his cousin, another dull fellow." "Was the Marquis then presumed dead?" "Oh, yes, sir. This all happened 15 years ago, at least. Mind you," the Cornish Fiddler laughed once more, "the cousin didn't get much other than the name. It had all been gambled away. He sounds a bad lad, this Marquis." "Oh, he was that all right, sir. A very naughty chap." They turned into the street, and John spotted an alehouse. "I think I can see what you're seeking." And sure enough, there was little fat Giles coming out and staring about him. "Here!" John called, and the jolly man saw them and waved. Handing the blind fiddler into his care, John made his way back to the Lion to find out what, if anything, Tim Painter had been up to. As he might have suspected, there was a woman involved. John made his way into the inn, only to stop short. There, ahead of him, were Muriel Legassic and Tabitha Bligh. Seeing him as soon as he appeared, the women came up, all giggles and grins. "Why, Mr. Rawlings, this is a regular reunion. We came here to visit some elderly relatives, only to discover that Mr. Painter and your own dear self had booked in. What a splendid thing!" It was Mrs. Legassic, eyes enormous behind her glasses, who spoke. Tabitha Bligh had her say. "It's so nice to see you again, sir. I was wondering what we would do for some gay company." They nodded and smiled at him, but it was to Anne Anstey that John's eyes were drawn. She and Tim were sitting side by side, wrapped in deep conversation, staring at one another intently. She glanced up as the apothecary entered and gave him a look which proclaimed her triumph in securing a man. In fact, she positively sneered at John that he had missed his chance, a fact which infuriated him, as he had never even liked the wretched woman. She moved largely and made a fanning motion with her hand. "Well, sir, we meet again. How nice to see you." John gave a curt bow. "Madam, I was just saying to Mr. Painter here that Helstone had grown very dull, and we were hard put to it to raise a smile. We therefore decided that Redruth would suit us better. But where, may I ask, are the Marchese and your daughter?" "They have returned home, madam. They left early this morning." "And you allowed them to go unescorted? My! Jed was driving the coach, and Rufus carried shotgun. I think they're reasonably well protected. My late husband would never allow me to travel alone. He insisted on accompanying me wherever I went." "How awkward for you," John said tartly. She shot him a look from her great slumberous eyes, which for some reason made him feel uncomfortable. Then she turned away. Tim Painter, meanwhile, was inviting her to dine with him. "I couldn't possibly, sir. I have my friends to consider." "Oh, Rawlings can look after them, can't you, old chap?" Horrified, the apothecary gave a hasty bow. "Alas, I have a previous engagement. I'm afraid I cannot oblige. Forgive me." And turning on his heel, he marched out of the Lion, leaving Tim Painter to sort out the problem. Despite the horrid thought of spending the evening in the company of Mrs. Legassic and Mrs. Bligh, he felt guilty and a little ashamed of himself. After all, they had done nothing to him. It was just that he found them utterly boring. He was on the point of turning back and making an excuse about his engagement having been cancelled and facing the evening like a man, when a rotund figure, in company with another, rolled out of an alehouse just ahead of him. John was just about to call out, when something furtive in their manner reduced him to silence. Instead, the apothecary found himself slinking into a doorway until they were several yards ahead of him. Then, walking quietly and not drawing attention to himself, John started to follow Messrs. Sayce and Rees as they made their way through the back streets of Redruth. Ahead of him, the couple walked quite straightly, as if they had purpose, and also as if they knew precisely where they were going. It seemed to the apothecary, straining his ears, that they proceeded in silence, almost grimly, in fact. Wondering where on earth they were bound, John walked along behind them, keeping his distance. And then, to his amazement, they turned into the courtyard where he had been earlier, and made their way up to the front door of the big house. They pulled the bell, and after a short interval were admitted, leaving the apothecary quite literally standing. Wondering what to do next, he made his way into the nearby alehouse and ordered himself a large glass of Gascon wine. The Cornish Fiddler and his gang had all left, and the place was practically deserted. John decided to converse with a serving wench who was wandering about idly. "Good afternoon, my dear." She gave him a suspicious glance. "Afternoon?" she said in a broad Cornish accent. "Not many people about." "No, they've been gone for their dinner." This reminded the apothecary that he hadn't eaten, and at that moment, as if to endorse the fact, his stomach rumbled loudly. He patted it. "Excuse me." The girl smiled and looked a bit more friendly. "Hungry, are you?" "Ravenous." "I got a bit of rabbit pie." John gave her a grin which twisted up on one side. "I'd like that very much, please." "Then you shall have it, young sir." She disappeared into the back, and John was left alone with his thoughts. The blind fiddler had told him that the house was owned by Lord Lisle, so though he wouldn't have put them down as the people who might be on calling terms with the nobility, it was possible that Sayce and Rees knew the man. It was even possible, just, that the aged aunt might be a resident at Lord Lisle's house. The apothecary, while he was waiting, ran through a list of excuses as to why he should visit Lord Lisle, but none of the reasons seemed legitimate. In the end, all he could do was wolf down his belated dinner and sink a pint of ale, still in a quandary as to what action to take. Eventually, he decided to watch the house against the moment when Sayce and Rees should reappear. Standing outside, discreetly hidden from prying eyes, John waited until dusk fell, but there was still no sign of the two visitors. Eventually deciding that they must have come out while he was in the alehouse, he turned disconsolately in the direction of the Lion. And then, behind him, he heard the front door open quietly. Wheeling round, and at the same time hiding in some sheltering darkness, he looked rapidly across. A hooded figure had come out. A figure that sent a shiver down John's back, from the silent way it stood framed in the doorway, before it made its way through the gardens and out of his line of sight. Back in the Lion, he found the two ladies looking round madly for someone with whom to play cards. Greeted like a long-lost brother, John felt that he had no option but to agree, and sat down reluctantly at the table. Being a poor player, and not really enjoying himself, he decided to make the best of it by asking one or two questions. "Where is Mrs. Anstey?" he began. A look shot between the duo, together with an audible giggle. "She has retired," said Mrs. Bligh, barely suppressing a laugh. "She had a megrim." "Dear me! And what of Mr. Painter? Did he have a megrim too?" Now they laughed aloud. "Oh, Mr. Rawlings, you are so droll," said Mrs. Legassick, wiping her eyes. "What will you think of next?" "Who knows, madam?" John replied, laying a card. "Whatever fancy catches me, I dare say." He changed the subject. "By the way, do either of you ladies know the name of a great house belonging to Lord Lisle? It stands just outside the town." Was it his imagination, or did a frisson run between the two of them? After a few seconds' silence, Mrs. Legassick spoke. "I know the place of which you speak, but I do not recall its name." "It's called Tryon House, I believe," said Tabitha Bligh. He looked at her and decided to change the subject. "And how are you enjoying your stay in Redruth?" he asked. "Very well, thank you, sir. It is a most pleasant town." "Which reminds me," said John, laying another card, but at the same time watching their expressions, "I saw two of your many cousins, namely Herbert Rees and Eustace Sayce, tonight." "Oh, really?" said Mrs. Bligh. "And where were they, then?" "Strangely enough, they were going into Tryon Place," John answered, and was rewarded by the look of frozen horror that appeared on both their faces. Chapter 22. That night, John slept particularly heavily, and woke late. Putting a hand out to seize and look blearily at his travelling clock, he saw that it was after 10, and that he had missed his favourite meal of the day. Even getting out of bed was an effort. In fact, every muscle in his body ached, as if he had been given a severe kicking. Yet he had done nothing more strenuous than play cards with the ladies and drink a little wine. Feeling ghastly, John washed and dressed and went downstairs. There was nobody about, and his need to take some fresh air was critical. Hoping he did not look as bad as he felt, the apothecary made his way into the street. The town was particularly deserted, and he walked along aimlessly, then found that his steps were leading him towards Tryon House, almost of their own accord. Suddenly, he decided on the reckless venture of taking a closer look at the place, of making an attempt to get into the grounds to see where it was that the hooded figure had been heading. As so often happened with the apothecary, action followed immediately on the thought, and he quickened his pace, walking with more determination. As he made his way, he thought of the word uttered by Gypsy Orchard. She had said "wicker," and had appeared quite nervous at the sight of the Colquite brothers. Could they really, thought John, be involved in magic? Apparently such a pair of harmless old duffers, they seemed stupid more than anything else. But was this an act, he wondered? Did their bland, silly old man act mask something far more sinister? At last he was heading out of town, and Tryon House appeared in the distance. Once again the apothecary gazed on its pillared entrance and the large courtyard that stood before it. Yesterday it had been packed with people while the Cornish Fiddler played, but today it stood empty, other than for a stable boy listlessly sweeping away the signs of recent habitation. Boldly John approached. "Good morning, my man. Is Lord Lisle within?" "No, sir. He'm be gone for his morning ride." "Oh, really? Whereabouts did he head?" "Out to the countryside beyond. Shall I say you called, sir?" "Yes," John called over his departing shoulder. "Tell him John Rawlings wants to see him." But the apothecary was running, seized by an idea and determined to put it into action. He sped back to the Lion and round to the stables, where an hostler was idling round in the yard, sucking a straw and whistling. "Quick," called John. "Saddle up my horse, would you?" Looking slightly astonished, the man complied, and 15 minutes later the apothecary was mounted and making his way out of town. How he would know Lord Lisle when he saw him, he had no idea, but he was determined to find the fellow and somehow or other get into conversation with him. Countryside lay all round Redruth, it being a small town, though considerably bigger than Helstone. Further, there were several horsemen out and about, and the apothecary was beginning to think he had taken on a hopeless task, when he spotted 2 riders in the distance. Somehow he knew that one was Lord Lisle, the lucky man who had won Tryon House gaming at cards. Indeed, he recognized the fellow from the crowd of people listening to the music on the previous evening. So certain was he that he had found his quarry that he urged his horse into a canter. However, he had not taken into consideration the temperament of the beast. Liking to go at its own pace, the grey horse with the uncertain eye sped off into a gallop, leaving the apothecary to be tossed about like a ship in a gale. Clinging on for all he was worth, he shot past the 2 men, giving them a frantic look as he did so. They laughed. He heard them do it. But for all that, they set off in pursuit, presumably to try and slow the horse up. And then the creature stopped short, and John went sailing over its head, landing in the grass below with a thud. "Are you all right?" called a voice. And John, looking up, saw that a tall man with a young but worldly face was dismounting and coming to his side. "I think so," he answered, heaving himself into a sitting position and feeling his arms and legs. "You took a nasty tumble, sir," said the other, also getting off his mount. "I'm afraid I'm not a very good rider." "Not local, then?" "No. I come from London." "Well, let's get you on your feet and see what damage has been done." They put a hand under each arm and hauled the apothecary upwards. "Can you stand?" asked the worldly man. "Just about." "Nothing broken, then?" "No, I don't think so." And then came the stroke of good fortune that John had been hoping for. The second man turned to the tall one and said, "Should we take him back to the house, my lord?" "Why not? I could do with a bit of company. Here, you get on my horse. I'll ride that grey beast." And the next thing John knew was that his foot was in the stirrup, and he had been half lifted by the second man, presumably a servant, into his lordship's saddle. With the effortless ease of someone who had been riding almost as soon as he could walk, Lord Lisle swung himself into the saddle, pulled the reins tightly, and said, "Don't you play tricks on me, you brute," before setting off at a trot towards civilization. Half an hour later, they were back, seated in the drawing-room, while several male servants fussed round the apothecary looking for injuries. Meanwhile, Milord, draped languidly in a great chair, observed the process and sipped a morning glass of sherry. "You've had a lucky escape, my friend." John, thinking to himself that his lordship would never know how lucky, said, "I must thank you, sir, for your gallant rescue. It was immeasurably kind of you. Allow me to present myself. My name is John Rawlings, apothecary of Shug Lane, Piccadilly." "Anthony Lisle," answered the other carelessly. "Would you like a glass of sherry?" "Very much, thank you." Lord Lisle waved a lazy arm. "A poor one, Simmons, and you can refill my glass at the same time." He turned to John and laughed. "An apothecary, eh? Well, have you broken anything?" John felt his arms and legs once more. "No, I can honestly say that I'm in one piece, though I'll be many shades of purple tomorrow. A fine sight indeed. Good thing that I happen to be around. Where are you staying?" "At the Lion." His lordship raised his brows and nodded, making no comment. "And what is your purpose in visiting Redruth?" Before waiting for a reply, he went on, "I come here for a month or two now and then, but our family seat is in Worcester, and naturally I have a town house." John decided to be daring. "Is it true that you won this place, gambling?" Lisle let out a short laugh. "Perfectly. I was 18 at the time, and had staked all I had on the turn of a card. Fortunately, it worked my way, and I won everything, leaving the Marquis of Dorchester minus the place. But surely he had other homes to go to." An extremely sly grin crossed Lord Lisle's face. "He not only wagered this house." "Poor devil! You mean you took everything?" "Everything. People said I had the luck of Satan himself that night." He laughed robustly, and John, looking at him, thought the man a typical example of his class, a younger member of the aristocracy who would gamble his life away to relieve his perpetual boredom. "You certainly seem to have done. Was Lady Lisle pleased with your new home, sir?" Milord shrugged. "She moves from one to the other as she wishes, usually choosing a house where I am not resident." The apothecary felt faintly amused that anyone could live such a shallow life. "You do not get on?" he asked boldly. His lordship let out a snort. "Get on? We detest one another. She is thin and simple, and was foisted on me by my father. I can't stand the sight of her." "I take it there are no children?" "There's one sickly boy who follows his mother around as if he were tied to her, and that is that. I have provided the heir and done my duty." He held out his sherry glass, which was duly refilled, crossed his ankles, and grinned at the apothecary. John, peering at him over the rim of his glass, wondered just how much emotion he actually felt about his current situation. Lord Lisle seemed to come to a sudden decision. "I like you," he said. "Come and look over my estate." Knowing that all of this had once belonged to the Marquis of Dorchester, John stepped out of a huge pair of French doors and into a vast garden. It was laid out in terraces full of yew hedges, rose borders brimming with buds, while over the balustrades climbed clematis, much of it in full bloom. A pillared folly, in which stood iron garden furniture, lay before them. This, in turn, led on to an alley whose lush green grass was bordered by Irish yews. Lord Lisle, glancing at his companion's awe-struck face, led the way down to an ornamental lake, on the banks of which was moored a little rowing boat. On the far bank were some ruins, standing dark and strangely mysterious, contrasting with the beauty of the rest of the surroundings. "What are they?" asked John, pointing. "All that's left of Roskillie Abbey." Do you want to have a closer look? Yes, I'd like to see. We'll go by boat, then. It will be quicker than walking. They climbed into the small vessel, and John, almost automatically, and despite the aching in his limbs, picked up the oars. Meanwhile, my lord dipped his fingers idly in the water and hummed to himself as they skimmed the surface. Coming to the other bank, John saw a mooring post and a jetty, and somehow or other managed to scramble out and secure the craft. Lord Lisle, taking his time and clearly conserving his energy, followed at his own pace. The Abbey had obviously been big and important in its day, but the death blow delivered by Henry VIII meant that now only a skeleton of its former glory stood to tell the tale of a once proud history. John, looking up at what had been the chapter house, walked along decayed and deserted cloisters, staring at the remains of the great church. And then he had an optical illusion. He could have sworn that a hooded figure dressed in a monk's habit had passed quickly round the corner of the church and vanished from his sight. He stared, then looked round for his lordship, who had sat down in the sunshine, taking his ease, his back turned. John stood uncertainly for a moment, then made his way to where he had seen the apparition. There was nothing and nobody there. The ruins of the church were deserted and empty. All that John could sense was a faint smell like incense permeating the brickwork. Yet there was nothing surprising about that, he thought. After all, this had been the place where the monks had prayed. Yet the ghost, if indeed it had been such, had made him uneasy. Involuntarily, there, in the bright sunshine, something walked over John's grave. He made his way back to where Lord Lisle, apparently asleep, sat leaning against the stonework, eyes closed. He opened one as the apothecary approached. "Like it?" he asked. "Yes, it's a very fine ruin." "Tell me, is it haunted?" "Zoons, yes. The locals won't come near the place. There's talk of ghostly processions of monks chanting and carrying lanthorns. It has a terrible reputation." "Why?" "I thought I saw something." "Did you, by Jove? Well, you aren't the first, and you certainly won't be the last. What was it?" "A hooded figure, wearing a habit." Lord Lisle looked wise. "That would be Brother Mark. They say he was killed when Henry VIII ordered the abbey to close. He died fighting before the altar, so legend has it." "Oh, I see." But the apothecary was not happy. The story of Brother Mark gallantly losing life in the most holy place in the abbey somehow did not match what he had seen, for there had been something furtive and almost sinister about the apparition, a something that made him shiver again despite the unexpected warmth of the morning. "Seen enough?" asked his lordship. Not quite. Can you spare another 10 minutes?" "Certainly. I shall doze. Wake me when you're ready to go." As Lord Lisle once more closed his eyes, John hurried back to the place where he had seen the supposed ghost. There was nothing there, of course, but despite that, the apothecary started to search the building thoroughly. Then he dropped to his knees and hunted along the ground, running his fingers over the soil as he did so. It was painstaking and hard, but eventually he was rewarded. His hand closed over a tiny stump of candle. Swiftly he picked it up and slipped it into a pocket. It proved nothing, of course, as it could have been dropped by an earlier visitor to the abbey. But nevertheless, it was some indication that the ghost may well have been mortal. Slowly John made his way back to where Lord Lisle sat, eyes closed in the sunshine, and loud snores emanating from the noble nostrils. But he woke at once and clambered into the boat, taking his turn to row back cheerfully enough. John sat facing him, watching the abbey grow more distant, thinking about what he had seen, and determining to go back to the place after dark to find out more about the creatures of the night. Having been warned by Lord Lisle's hostler that the grey horse with the unfriendly eye had an erratic temperament, John walked back, leading the creature by the reins. Having thankfully handed her into the care of the Lion's stables, he made his way within. As usual, Tim Painter was recounting some yarn or other in the tap-room. He turned as John entered and gave the apothecary a meaningful wink. "My dear chap, where have you been? I was about to organize a search party." John looked at him in amusement. "Last I saw of you was deep in the clutches of Anne Anstey. How did it go?" Tim waved a hand in front of his face. "I cannot discuss it. Let me merely say that I feel utterly exhausted." John grinned. The fellow was such a reprobate, and was clearly going to get worse over the years. "I've spoken to the blind fiddler," he said. "Have you, by God? Then our work here is done." "Not quite." And drawing Tim into a private corner, John told him his adventures since he had got up that morning. To give the man his due, he listened intelligently and in silence, nodding occasionally. Finally he said, "So, you think there's something strange going on in the Abbey ruins?" "It's just an instinct I have. It's not based on much, but I feel compelled to go back at night." Tim scratched his chin. "Do you think Lord Lisle is involved?" "I would imagine he is. Remember, I saw a robed and hooded figure leave his house. He's rich and idle and incredibly bored. In my view, he's either part of what goes on or is turning a blind eye." "Then let's do it." And Tim Painter rubbed his hands together. "Tonight? Why not? Anne Anstey is playing cards with friends, so I shan't be seeing her. I'm at your disposal, sir. We'll have to gain access to his grounds. An easy task." Tim was silent, then said, "Pity we haven't got habits and hoods ourselves." John nodded. "I don't see us finding any at this late stage. We'll just have to wear black." And suddenly he laughed, feeling incredibly young and reckless. "Tally-ho," he said. Tim raised his glass. "To the chase." "Indeed," answered John, and clinked his in response. Chapter 23. The night had grown unseasonably cold, and rowing across the lake in the little boat proved a thoroughly chilling experience. Entry into the huge parkland owned by Lord Lisle had been as easy as Tim Painter had predicted. They had simply chosen a place where the wall was in need of repair and climbed over it. John had stood for a minute, disorientated. Then a glimmer of water in the moonlight had been enough to set him on track, and the two men, keeping within the shadow of the trees, had made their way towards the lake. Once on it, the apothecary realized, they would be clearly visible. Not from the house, which lay back amongst the huge and sheltering gardens, but from any other pairs of eyes that might also be watching that night. Nevertheless, to walk round the stretch of water would take rather a long time and might also place them in danger. After a whispered discussion, the two men decided to row across and take their chance. Night on the lake was very different from its daytime aspect. Banks of reed, habitat of ducks and waterfowl, became inky black pools, while the water itself, by daylight quite blue and sparkling, turned into something dark and unfriendly. The small boat became wet round their feet, and Tim was forced to bail while John rowed, the sound of his oars loud and clear in the silence of the night. Meanwhile, the shape of the derelict abbey reared tall and terribly menacing as they approached the jetty. "What are you hoping to find?" whispered Tim. John shrugged his shoulders and put his finger to his lips as the boat slid into the mooring spot and he leapt ashore. Tim, no doubt to prove his athleticism, followed suit, but slipped on the dampness, making an unmistakable crash. Furiously, John glared at him and plucked him into the shadows of the chapter house wall, where they crouched side by side, waiting for something to react to the noise. But only silence echoed back at them, and after a few minutes they both relaxed. End of Side 11. Side 12. "Nobody here?" Tim muttered. "Not yet," John answered meaningfully. "What do you mean by that?" "I'm not sure." "And how long do you think we should wait?" "At least an hour." "Thank God I brought a hip flask," Tim answered, and took a swig. They changed to a sitting position, and stayed like that for a while. Then Painter stood up. "I think I'll go for a look round." "Why?" "Because you've got some idea of the size of this place, while I have none." "Then I'll come with you, but for heaven's sake, be quiet." "Don't be silly, man. There's no one about." John replied, "I'm not so certain." Together, they crept out of their place of concealment and began a moonlit tour of the abbey, which was even larger than John had at first realized. Many of the buildings were minus a roof, but still had 4 walls standing. Others were crumbling into total decay. "It must have been a powerful order in its day," Tim commented, gazing up to where beautiful windows, now totally without glass, had dominated the rooms beneath. But John did not answer, instead straining his ears to catch a faint sound. "Listen. Can you hear anything?" Tim relapsed into silence. "No, I don't think so." There it is again. You must be able to hear it." Painter turned a panic-stricken face towards him. "It's chanting, and it's getting nearer." "Quick," said John, and seizing his companion by the elbow, hurried him into the great and gloomy ruined church. "Is it ghosts?" The apothecary made a sound of disgust. "They're as human as you and me." And so saying, he dragged Tim Painter into the dark recesses of a side chapel and crouched behind a tomb. Tim ducked down beside him. "Who is it?" he whispered. John shrugged once more and motioned him to be quiet, all his attention focused on the church's arched and doorless entrance. Scarcely breathing, he and Tim watched fascinated as 2 figures dressed as monks, one of them bearing a lanthorn, came in. The other carried a censer swinging on a chain, which he shook as he proceeded along. Behind them came a procession of people, all dressed similarly, but it was their chanting that sent a shiver through the apothecary. Low and deep, it was a chilling sound that seemed to penetrate through to his very soul. Stealing a glance at Tim, he saw that the man was pale as a shadow. Behind this initial procession, which numbered about 24, came people in ordinary clothes, their faces disguised by masks. For those who had none, the device of pulling hats well down had to suffice. John, watching them, was seized by an idea, and as the last drew level and passed where he was hidden, he too joined them at the back of the line, bending his face so that it was hidden by shadow. Tim Painter, clearly losing courage, remained where he was. The leaders halted before the altar and threw back their hoods, revealing none other than Lord Lisle and a dark stranger who produced a crucifix from within his robe and deliberately and slowly turned it upside down. John's blood ran cold. He was about to witness the Black Mass. He could not look. He was not a religious man, but something in him rebelled against anything so profane happening in a place that had once been used by deeply religious men to celebrate the love of God. Yet his eye could not help but be drawn as a figure stepped out of the line and threw back its cassock to reveal Anne Anstey, naked, her flesh overflowing. Without pausing, she threw herself backwards on the altar and parted her legs, writhing about as if Satan himself were pleasuring her. From the chapel to his left, John could hear Tim Painter gasping. The smell of incense filled the air, and the sound of chanting grew louder as the witches formed a circle. He heard words that he did not understand, saw the crucifix passed round so that the celebrants might spit on it, heard Christ denounced and the congregation swear fealty to Satan. Then one of the males did in fact copulate with Anne Anstey in full view of the rest of the coven. As he jerked on top of her, his hood fell back to reveal Geoffrey Colquhoun. Sickened beyond words, the apothecary attempted to move away, but was forced to remain where he was because the man in front of him turned at the sound of John's feet. Eventually, though, all was done, and pulling up their hoods, the coven processed out of the church and away, leaving Mrs. Anstey, who appeared to be in some form of cataleptic trance, still lying naked on the altar. John, who had loitered behind, hurried to Tim Paynter's side to find him sitting on the floor with an expression of horror on his face. "By God's life, I've never seen the like of it." That was the Black Mass. And her. He pointed to the inert body. "Zoons, we've all been naughty in our time, but that was utterly flagrant. I think she was having some kind of seizure." Tim giggled loudly. "She had a seizure, all right." It was a blessed relief to laugh, and John did, enjoying the normality of it. "What shall we do with her?" he asked. "Leave her, of course. Presumably one of her friends will return for her. I can't see you and I lugging that mass of flesh back in such a little boat." The mental picture was so vivid that John had to suppress another fit of laughing. "Come on, let's go while the coast is clear." Tim struggled to his feet, glancing as he did so in the direction of the altar. From it came the noise of low moaning. "Oh, rot the old bitch," he said with contempt. But John was already making for the arched entrance, moving quietly but with determination. Paynter followed, and they reached the landing stage without meeting anyone, but there a shock awaited them. 2 cowled figures stood in readiness, guarding the boat, waiting for whoever it was who had rowed across in the moonlight. "I'll take the one on the right," John whispered, and without further ado leapt on the man and wrestled him to the ground. Meanwhile, Tim swung a mighty blow to the other man's chin, rendering the fellow insensible. Then he turned to assist his companion, jumping on his assailant's back and pummeling him with his fists. In the end, they overpowered him, though he was built like an ox and was equally as strong. Gasping, John Rawlings tied the man's hands behind him with his monk's girdle, then mopped his bloody mouth. "I was utterly wrecked by falling from my horse, and now this. A gallant endeavour, my friend," Tim answered as they got into the boat and pushed off. He took the oars. "What do you think about what we have just witnessed?" "Well, Lord Lisle is deeply involved, as are Anne Anstey and the brothers Colquite. But what about the rest of that cosy nest of cousins?" "All of them, I should imagine," John answered gloomily. A thought occurred which he did not speak aloud. Could Isabel's disappearance be linked to the fact that a coven of witches had been in Helstone to see the Furry Dance? Surely they had not been into human sacrifice. But remembering the final scenes of the Black Mass he had just witnessed, when Anne Anstey and Geoffrey Colquite had lain shrieking on the altar, almost anything was possible. As if he had read the apothecary's thoughts, Tim said, "You don't think they captured Isabel, do you?" John looked at him out of an eye that was swelling up rapidly. "I believe it's possible." "Then she's dead," Tim answered flatly. "I'm afraid she is," came the bleak reply. They reached the Lion safely, and despite their truly dishevelled appearance, made at once for the tap-room, where they restored themselves with a cognac, a particularly good French one, John noticed, wondering how far the smuggling trade extended. "That," said Tim, after his third, "is something I never want to witness again." "Nor I. But they knew we were there, you know." "But not till afterward, surely." The apothecary made a face. "I'm not certain about that. But the presence of the boat was all they needed. Then they were positive." "We've been seen, of course." John nodded. "I know. That's why I think it wise if we get out of town early tomorrow morning." "My thoughts entirely." "Then I suggest we get some sleep," the apothecary answered. But even though he was utterly exhausted, he could not lose consciousness, his mind full of the events of the evening, his brain so powerfully charged that it worked on regardless of the fact that he was longing for rest. Thus he was awake when he heard the sound of the lightest of footfalls in the passageway outside his bedroom. In an instant John was out of bed and reaching for his pistol, when the door, which he had omitted to lock, was flung open and 2 men appeared in the entrance. "Don't move," said a gruff voice, "and put your arms high." John instantly complied, thinking it far better to obey at this stage of the proceedings. "What's this all about?" he asked, with as much dignity as he could muster. "Lord Lisle wants to see you." "Now," came the reply. And without further ado, they had seized him by either shoulder and hustled him downstairs, still only wearing his nightshirt. A coach was waiting outside, and before John could as much as protest, he found himself bundled in, one guard mounting the box, the other sitting opposite him with a loaded pistol pointing at his ribs. The apothecary thought frantically. Nobody who knew him, even by sight, had witnessed him being present at this evening's terrible ceremony. It must be description alone, probably from the men guarding the boat that his lordship was acting on. His best way was to bluff it out and hope that he sounded convincing. At Tryon House, he received the same treatment, being roughly handled into a drawing-room where he was pushed into a chair and told to keep quiet. "I wouldn't dream of speaking to you," he stated. "I shall deal with Anthony Lisle and nobody else." The guards exchanged a look, but said nothing, and a voice behind him responded icily, "Well, what do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Rawlings?" And Lord Lisle strolled into view. He was dissolute, that much was certain, and tonight his lordship was pale. Yet he had covered this paleness, or rather accentuated it, by a smearing of face paint, complete with carmined lips and penciled eyes. In short, he looked frightful, a travesty of the man who had rescued John from his plunge off the horse. The apothecary went straight in on the attack. "May I ask the meaning of this, sir?" Milord looked at him languidly. "I think you know." He gestured with his hand, and the two guards withdrew immediately. "I think you were present this evening." John assumed a haughty expression. "Would you be kind enough to explain that remark?" "There's no need for all that bravado. You were there all right." "Where?" John demanded, determined to pin the man down. "You know damned well," came the snarled reply. "If I knew what you were talking about, I might be able to respond. But if you want the facts, I spent the entire evening in company with my friend Mr. Painter. We dined together, we played chess, and then we retired. So what is the meaning of this outrage?" For the first time, a look of uncertainty crossed Lord Lisle's face. "Are you telling me that you did not go to the Abbey?" John's expression of righteous indignation was masterly. "The Abbey? Why should I want to return there? I've seen the place." His lordship poured himself a drink, and the apothecary saw that his hand was shaking. "Then who was it?" John heard him mutter. He stood up. "I've a mind, sir, were it not for the fact that you rescued me when my horse had thrown me, to lay a charge against you." Lord Lisle made one last attempt to win the day. "I'd like to see you try." "Don't tempt me," John answered, and thrust his face close to that of his captor. His lordship backed away. "Is it possible that I owe you an apology?" he said, his voice full of disbelief. "Sir, you do. I have been seized from my bed by two blackguards and brought before you to answer some ridiculous accusation of visiting that god-forsaken abbey. Merciful heaven, sir, can you not see that I'm in my night attire?" Lord Lisle downed his drink in a single swallow. "Mr. Rawlings, what can I say? You have been mistaken for some trespasser upon my property. Please accept my sincerest regrets. I would not have had you treated so." Be magnanimous in victory, John thought. Aloud he said, "If I may have a drink before I return to bed. Mr. Painter and I are off early in the morning." "Oh, really? And where are you heading to?" asked Lord Lisle, as he poured a goodly measure into a glass. "We are returning to Helstone," said John. "Ah," said his lordship, his face quite ghastly in the candlelight. "I have a little property there. I visit it from time to time. In fact, you have decided me. I shall follow you some time tomorrow." "Really," said John, sipping his drink. "And may I ask where your house is situated?" "Of course," answered Lord Lisle. "It overlooks Low Pool." Chapter 24. To say that Mrs. Pill looked drained of vitality would have been to half state the case. Indeed, she seemed to have lost the will to live. Tim, who had slipped once more into the role of feckless lover, stood about looking helpless, while John returned to the room he had ordered to be kept for him to fetch his medical bag. Administering salts, he said, "I presume that your search was in vain?" "She has vanished off the face of the earth," came the heartbroken reply. And John, remembering Lord Lisle's face as he had described his house overlooking the pool, thought perhaps he ought to tell her what he suspected. But something, probably the piteous sight that the poor woman represented, stopped him. Instead, he asked the whereabouts of her brother. "He is around somewhere, I believe, with the servants. He wants us to depart tomorrow. But I can't bear to go." Her voice broke in a sob. "Madam," John said quietly, "I think perhaps you should." "But it would mean leaving—" Tim Painter spoke up. "Catherine, it's time you faced reality. You're not going to find Isabel." "Do you mean that she is dead?" "Yes," her lover answered bluntly. He could have spared her the pain somehow, though how, John could not at that moment guess. In response to his words, Mrs. Pill crumpled up, her face contorted into an almost simian cast of features. "Oh, God!" she cried. John put his arms round the wretched woman, holding her tightly against him. "Come now," he said soothingly. It was utterly inane, but he could think of nothing else to say, certain as he was that Tim was right. At that moment, Jasper joined them, casting a look of immense dislike in Painter's direction. "I thought something smelt bad," he said. Tim lost his temper quite suddenly. "Take that back, or I'll floor you," he shouted. "Why, you rotten little upstart!" It was enough. With a flying leap, Tim crossed the distance between them and grappled with Catherine's brother. At this, she let out a dismal wail, beating her fists on John's chest. "Oh, no! Oh, no!" she howled. "This, on top of everything else I have to bear! Jasper, for the love of heaven, stop fighting!" But it was no use. They were whacking one another like a couple of schoolboys. Extricating himself gently, the apothecary attempted to part them, feeling far from up to doing so. As well as the bruises he had obtained from falling from his horse, he had been involved in a fight the night before which had damaged both his eye and his lip. In fact, he looked a sorry spectacle as he strained to part the warring couple, not very successfully. Indeed, it was the landlord of the Angel who, just stepping out into the street as he was, finally parted them. John, defeated, turned his attention back to Mrs. Pill. "Why don't you go tomorrow, my dear?" "And with whom should I travel? You've seen those two for yourself. Travel with Tim, and let Jasper go with the servants." Catherine's miserable little face came close to John's own. "I don't know that I want him any more. I think he's a liability rather than an asset." Seeing sense at last, thought the apothecary. "But then," she added brokenly, "where else would I find such a man to be with? I am no beauty when all's said and done, and Tim is handsome, is he not?" "Very," John answered dryly. "Then there we are. You have hit on my dilemma." "I have said nothing," John thought. Aloud he remarked, "You must weigh the situation carefully, Mrs. Pill. After all, the whole of the rest of your life depends on it." At this point, Tim came over, his beautiful face somewhat beaten round the edges. "Your brother has extremely hard fists, Catherine. As far as I'm concerned, I never want to see the oaf again." "Why make my life even more difficult?" she asked, rounding on him. I have made it difficult. "I think you exaggerate, madam. Surely it is your brother who is the founder of your problems." Mrs. Pill's trembling chin stuck out. "Jasper is merely trying to protect me." "Then let him," said Tim suddenly. "I've had enough of this conversation. I'm off to the Blue Anchor. Coming, Rawlings?" "I'll follow you," John answered. He turned back to Catherine. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," came the miserable reply. "I'll have to think about it. I shall come to my decision in the morning." Yet something in her tone of voice told the apothecary all he needed to know. Mrs. Pill would rather suffer all kinds of indignities than be without a man, particularly one so very good-looking as Tim Painter. Come what may, she was going to remain with him. The journey back to Helstone had been uneventful. Tim had ridden the grey horse, while John had travelled on his mount, a more successful arrangement. Also, they had taken their time about getting back, and had stopped at a wayside inn for refreshment. Thus, though very different people, they had shared a great deal, and John could honestly say that he liked the fellow, for all he was shiftless and idle, and, no doubt, represented a nightmare to any woman. "You know I spent the night with Mrs. Anstey," Tim had said, after his fourth jug of ale. "So I gathered. And to think, the next night she was thrashing about on the altar with horrible old Colquite. It's enough to make me ashamed." He had grinned. Almost. Now, a day later, in the confines of the Blue Anchor, he said, "Helstone is very quiet without that witchy bunch of people. Shall we move on?" John shook his head. "You may do as you please, Tim, but I have still to see Lord Godolphin, and have another chat with Nicholas Kitto." Tim had given him a dark look. "You don't think that I killed Diana Warwick, do you?" "Not really. According to the witness, she was alive when his lordship visited her." "What time was that?" "About midnight. But he was gone by 2 in the morning, when the blind fiddler went in, and if we're to believe him, found her dead." "She must have been a great slut," said Tim, and chuckled long and deep. "What time did you leave her?" "At about 11:30. Funnily enough, she seemed very insistent that I went." "Hardly surprising, if she had another admirer coming at midnight." "No, but it was more than that. It was as if she were nervous." "Do you think she was frightened of Lord Godolphin?" "She could have been." Tim struggled with a memory. "No, I think it was from the time she heard a noise." "What sort of noise?" asked John, suddenly intensely interested. "I don't know for sure. I'll spare you the details, but my attentions were otherwise engaged. But she heard something, and yes, I remember now. She looked towards the door." "Was it locked?" "No, I don't think it was. I think we went in rather a hurry, and we forgot." "And what happened then?" "I asked her what had disturbed her, but she said I was imagining it. So I just got on with things." Tim grinned, unabashed. "But looking back, you think that the door opened and somebody stood there?" "I'm not certain. As I said, I saw nothing." The apothecary was deeply thoughtful. "If that happened, and I repeat, if, then that person might well have been her murderer." For the first time, Tim looked serious. "Zoons! You may well be right. What a ghastly notion. Not very pleasant, I admit." "Poor Diana," said Tim, and fell to musing over his ale. John was silent, thinking hard. If the door had opened while Tim and Diana had been in flagrante delicto, and a jealous man had stood there, then look no further for the murderer. But who? That was the question. What pair of eyes had observed them and decided to act later that night? Full of uncertainty, the apothecary decided that he must see the 2 remaining witnesses, namely Lord Godolphin and Nicholas Kitto, probably father and son in his opinion, as soon as possible. Nick was obviously going to be the easier subject to find, so without ado, John Rawlings set out from the Blue Anchor and made his way up Coinage Hall Street, past the building that had given the place its name, then along Church Street, until he came to the house at the top. Here he rang the bell, which was answered by the usual servant. "Is Mr. Kitto in?" the apothecary asked, adding crisply, "I do not have an appointment." "I will see if he is at home, sir." And the maid, who was elderly, disappeared into the depths of the house. A few minutes later, Nick himself, looking older and dressed entirely in black, came to the front door. "Oh, it's you, Rawlings. Come in. Come in." He led the way into the drawing-room and said, without preamble, "It's Diana's funeral tomorrow. The coroner has agreed on it. The delay has been caused by an abortive attempt to find her relatives, but none have come forward, and no further waiting can be brooked." "Indeed not," said John, thinking of the state of the body. "Will you be attending?" Nicholas continued. "Yes, of course." "Do you know who else is going?" "I have no idea. A mere handful, I expect." "And where is it to be held?" Nicholas looked surprised. "Here, in the local churchyard. The ceremony will be conducted by the vicar. It is at 10:30 in the morning. I shall make a point of being there." John cleared his throat. "Tell me, my friend, are you coming to terms with her death?" "I have accepted the fact that I shall not see her any more, but it has not made life any easier to bear. To tell you the truth, I am missing her terribly." "I'm sure," the apothecary answered soothingly. "Now, tell me again. You went to her room at about 6 o'clock in the morning, is that correct?" "I've already told you, yes. And you saw no one about as you ascended the stairs?" "I passed some little maid with her thumb in her mouth, that was all." "And you found Diana dead?" "Yes." "Why do you want me to repeat everything? What would you say if I told you that someone else had discovered the body some 4 hours earlier?" Nicholas looked utterly astonished. "Who, for God's sake?" "The blind fiddler," John answered slowly. Kitto's face was a picture of disbelief. "The blind fiddler," he repeated. "Why him, of all people? What was he doing there?" "Much the same as you, I imagine." "What are you inferring?" snarled Nick Kitto, his face suddenly white and savage. "I'm saying that you were not Diana's only visitor that night." The attack was as unexpected as it was swift. The apothecary, covered with bruises and with a cut lip and black eye to boot, was suddenly knocked to the floor by a hammer blow to his jaw. "Oh, God, help us!" he bellowed, holding his face. But Nick was on top of him and pounding his head on the wood repeatedly. Every tooth the apothecary had shook violently, and his senses had started to swim when there was a sudden shout from the doorway. "Nicholas, whatever are you doing? Stop it at once! Do you hear me?" It was Mrs. Ennis, looking formidable in a purple gown with which her hair clashed violently. Her son, however, continued to crash away regardless. John felt himself to be on the point of losing consciousness when the rough treatment suddenly came to an end, and he was vaguely aware that Nick had been hauled to his feet and sent to stand a good few feet away. The apothecary had never been so glad to see anyone as his extremely unlikely rescuer. He looked at Nick's mother, glassy-eyed. "Thanks," he managed, from a mouth totally swollen. "My dear young man, whatever happened? Why was Nicholas attacking you?" Nicholas rolled his eyes at John, pleading in their depths. "A slight argument over a game of chance," the apothecary muttered inaudibly. This reply was treated with contempt, as there were no cards or dice visible. "How about the truth?" said Mrs. Ennis fiercely. Nicholas growled from the corner in which he had been sent to stand. "It was my fault. I attacked him." "Why, for heaven's sake?" "He was maligning a friend of mine." "I was telling the simple truth," answered John from the floor. Mrs. Ennis swelled up, resembling an egg more closely than ever. "Now, what is all this about? Mr. Rawlings, please explain." She helped him to stand, and he collapsed into a nearby chair, very much the worse for wear. Shooting a look at Nicholas, he saw that the young man was standing in the corner like a truculent little boy, sticking out his lower lip and generally pulling a sour face. No wonder he hadn't been man enough for Diana, John thought cruelly. Mrs. Ennis turned to her son. "Well, sir, as your friend will not speak, what do you have to say?" "Nothing." "A fine howd you do, indeed. Both remain silent when it comes to the cause of the quarrel. Well, you can leave my house, the pair of you. Go and fight in the street for all I care." "What about the neighbours?" muttered Nick. "Oh, they must take their chance," Mrs. Ennis snapped in reply. Weakly, John got to his feet and staggered towards the front door. Holding his somewhat crumpled hat in his hand, he made his way out, then turned towards the church, desperately needing somewhere quiet to sit for half an hour. But he had got no further than a few yards when a voice said, "Oh, my dear sir, you seem fit to drop." He looked up and into the clear eyes of Gypsy Orchard. "I don't feel too good," he replied weakly, before everything went black and he lost consciousness, seeing nothing but the stars whirling round his head. He came round, lying comfortably on a chaise, a cooling bandage on his forehead, some soothing ointment applied to both his eye and his lip. Watching him anxiously were the vicar and the gypsy. A rather odd combination, thought the apothecary wryly. "Ah, my dear sir," said Mr. Robinson, "you are back with us." Struggling, John sat up. "Yes, I apologize. I've had rather a harsh time of it in the last few days. It all started when I fell off my horse, and everything has grown progressively worse since then." Gypsy Orchard smiled. "Ah, the things you men get up to. Anyway, sir, I'll give you a little part of my special ointment for your eye and your mouth. Apply morning and night, and you'll soon be feeling better. Now, I'll leave you in the capable hands of Mr. Robinson. I must be on my way." "Where are you going?" John asked, genuinely wanting her to stay. She shrugged. "Wherever the fancy takes me." "Goodbye." And she turned and left the room. John propped himself upright. How did I get here, sir?" "The gypsy rang the doorbell and told me there was a sick man in the street. I carried you in with the aid of a servant." "Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Robinson—" John hesitated, not quite sure whether he should tell him. "Yes, my son?" "Sir, I have reason to believe there is a witch's coven based in a house near Low Pool." The vicar sighed wearily. "So I understand. The trouble is catching them at it." "There," said John, "I might be able to help you." "Really? Good heavens! What do you know of them?" The apothecary pointed to his swollen eye and lip. "One of their number gave me these. I attended a ceremony of theirs in the ruins of Roskillie Abbey, only as a hidden observer," he added hastily, as he saw a look of panic rise in Mr. Robinson's eye. "Really? How did you get there?" "It's a long story," said John, and suddenly he felt a great deal better to be discussing the matter with a clerk in holy orders. End of Side 12.